are true.
Company stores and other forms of abuse that governments didn't want to get involved with because they would be government overstepping.
Okay, maybe I need to do a video on the truck system, full stop, but for now, just a basic response. The employer obviously benefits from the truck system, and the employee is hurt by it. And so a truck system can be seen as a reduction in total compensation for the labor, compared to the laborer being paid in a more universal currency. Therefore, the truck system is, in effect, a pay cut. Right? It's a reduction in the value of what the workers are paid. It's just, a pay cut in kind of a non-standard form. And why would a company do this? Well, because they can earn back what they paid the people working for them. So, and workers will put up with this bullshit, be it a truck system, low wages, or anything else, to the extent that they don't have any alternative employers. As industrialization progresses, as you get more factories, there become more alternative employers, right? And so each individual factory becomes less monopsonistic in the labor market, and so each factory has to pay more to get the workers they need. And this pay can come in the form of higher wages, shorter working hours, more workplace control, or whatever else constitutes pay or compensation, right? And so that's all it is. And so these truck systems will be phased out to the extent that workers' bargaining power increases as labor becomes more scarce relative to capital. That is, as there become more factories and more people competing for labor.
Any unions that were formed were busted up, many times violently, and since the rich had their ears to the people in power, as they needed the funds to run elections, many times the military was used to bust up protests and strikes.
Okay, this stuff about unions is just so vague. Are we talking about workers getting together to bargain? Right, I have no problem with bargaining over, wages and stuff any more than I have with haggling at a market. Or are we talking about workers who strike and themselves use force to prevent the scabs from getting in? Right? Are you talking about the Pinkerton riots? Okay, so there are lots and lots of these events, right? The issue is complicated, and you just can't breeze over it like this and expect to do it any justice. Then you say, bust up a strike. What the hell does that even mean? If a company is being unfair to their employees by their employees' subjective standard of fairness, right, then the employee can quit and the company can try to hire new employees as replacements. If the company can't find adequate replacements, well, then they will either have to cave into the union's demands or they will have to go out of business. Right? If they can't find adequate replacements, well, then they can just fire the strikers and they'll go on just fine. Right? This is all just a bargain. Okay? The only reason I could see a company firing on their former employees is if the former employees were preventing the new employees from getting to their workplace and earning themselves a livelihood. Right? That is forming these picket lines and preventing these people from going to their jobs because they believe that they're not being paid enough. Right? In which case, and so if that's what's happening, then yeah, I fully endorse the company's decision to fire live ammo on these assholes. They're trespassers and they're barbarians. They're greedy and graspy, thinking that they are owed more, right? And they probably don't even realize just how small the profit margins are on these companies and how little sacking the consumption of the capitalists would affect them, would benefit them, right? And not appreciating how much it would hurt them to have the planners of the structure of production be sacked.
At a certain point, it got so bad after a bubble and a huge market crash.
What was that? Was the stock market crash in 1929 caused by strikebreakers? Well, I've heard lots of strange theories about the business cycle, but this would be something truly unique.
That President Franklin D. Roosevelt, liberally using the Constitution's Interstate Commerce Clause and the 14th Amendment, decided to do what was considered overstepping, and he set up social safety programs including infrastructure, libraries, education, and retirement. Infrastructure and education were given to raise the opportunity, and social programs were set up to ensure that spending would occur even in an economic downtime, as well as to allow everyone to spend the last years of their life with some form of enjoyment and dignity.
Okay, so he doesn't explain how strike breaking causes business cycles. He kind of made it seem like there was a transition there, but I guess there wasn't. Okay, so let's deal with the business cycle and the recession of 1919. Quick recap: the Austrian theory of the business cycle. The idea is that a bank, usually a central bank, somehow artificially expands credit. Central banking makes this process very easy. It can occur on smaller banks, on a smaller scale, without a central bank. And the results are all the localized bank panics you see. But really, when we're talking about, a countrywide depression, we're talking about central banks. Now, with more credit, people invest more than they would if the credit was only the result of real deferred consumption. And so this results in an overinvestment boom followed by a bust. Right? The reason the bust occurs is because people were investing as if they had 10 bricks when really they only had 5. And once it becomes apparent that there are only 5 bricks, they have to restructure or eliminate some of their prior investments. For a further explication of this, check out my video, The Business Cycle. Now, in 1919, there was actually an even deeper dip in the stock market as a percentage than there was in 1929. That is, and of course the stock market is not a perfect metric of how deep a malinvestment is, but it's, the best we have to go on. So, from what little evidence, from what evidence we have, it appears as if the initial malinvestment in 1919 was greater than the malinvestment in 1929. And yet, nobody knows about the depression of 1919. Why is this? Well, the reason people don't know about this is because the state didn't do anything, and so the malinvestments were very quickly cleared. Right? Now, the reason they cleared is because Woodrow Wilson at the time, who was the president at the time, had a stroke, and so wasn't able to intervene. And so I refer to this as America's stroke of luck. Right? Since Wilson was a big fan of state control, much like Roosevelt, he would have intervened, but since he had a stroke, he wasn't able to. Right? And so he wasn't able to prolong the Depression like Roosevelt did. But if that's not enough, there are some economists from UCLA, of all places, that actually say that the New Deal prolonged the Depression by about 7 years. And looking how long the Depression of 1919 lasted, that seems about right. As the Depression of 1919 lasted for about a few months, whereas the Depression of 1929 lasted for about 7 or 8 years. Right. So to say that it prolonged it for about 7 years, that makes sense. As for proclaiming that the state's spending on infrastructure and schooling led to greater innovation than would have occurred without said spending on schooling and infrastructure, that claim is unfalsifiable. And so for someone who's real interested in science, this is kind of a faux pas. But even though it's not falsifiable, there is strong evidence that this proclamation you made, An00bis, is false. First is that the number of patents applied for and issued in the U.S. did not shoot up following the Roosevelt administration, right? And patents are a crude metric, sure, but they've been flat all throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, like past the time you could say that the benefits started to accrue in the later generations. Well, here are the later generations, and they're not accruing. Okay, we can also look at the historical GDP growth from 1947 to today. And there doesn't appear to be any particular evidence in the growth pattern that shows that the infrastructure invested resulted in any greater growth, right? Or any limiting in the depth of the recessions. So what minimal evidence we do have suggests that these New Deal investments did not result in increased growth after, say, 20 years for their effects to be felt. Then he says something about government spending being good and... Okay, last thing. This will be really quick. Government spending, what that does, here's the thing. Government spending is paid for by other people. Okay, so if the government spends money, you are paying for that in one way or another. Deficit spending is paid for in the form of inflation. Right? There's more dollars going, because it's just creating more dollars somehow, and there are more dollars going around chasing the same number of goods. What that's is going to result in is the value of each dollar becoming less. Right? So that's the inflation tax. So if the government spends money, you're going to pay that tax. So let's say you have an economic downturn and the state starts to spend a whole bunch of money in an economic downturn. What's the result of that going to be? Is it going to result in more resources being activated and stuff? No, because any dollar that is spent comes from either income tax, or it's going to come from the inflation tax. So like no new resources are being created and or mobilized as a result of the state spending more money. It's just taking money from other forms of resources and the mobilization of those resources in other areas. Right? So just like this is an analytic truth. Spending money does not prime the pump. Right? It does not mobilize resources. Theoretically, it's an absurdity, and empirically, it prolonged the depression. Okay, that's it for part one. Maybe I'll go through more of, An00bis the doofus, more of An00bis the doofus's video. Maybe I won't, but so far, he has proven himself to be utterly unserious about finding economic truth. He seems to think that economics is some like simple. He thinks it's more simple than it really is, and I think what he's doing. He's a big time atheist, and so he's kind of just going headfirst into the default politics of the anti